We've organised this event in conjunction with FSC UK, and the aim really is to bring together, hopefully, a diverse array of stakeholders. What I've found in working in this sector is often we have really good conversations in forest management and supply chains, really good and interesting conversations with financial institutions and on the policy side. But often we miss bringing all of these different stakeholders and views together. So in the room today, we've got forest managers, we've got importers, we've got retailers, financial institutions, philanthropists, governments, all together. So utilize this time together to ask each other the difficult questions and how we're all approaching these issues from our respective positions. We want to discuss how business, the finance sector, and policy can help scale sustainable forest management, both locally and globally, to drive positive impacts for climate, but also for biodiversity. With COP30 around the corner, it's going to be held in the Brazilian Amazon in November, and as you will all know, we are scheduled to have the launch of the Tropical Forest Forever facility, so a big announcement for funding standing forests and land use changes, and that's set to dominate really the climate negotiations this year. And we want and hope that this event in some small way contributes to building momentum around that dialogue for sustainable forestry. And supporting a lot of the mechanisms that go towards ensuring that happens. Because healthy standing forests are vital for us to meet those climate ambitions that we've had set at successive climate COPs. Deforestation alone accounts for 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions, so we can't do it without tackling forestry and deforestation. Forests harbour 80% of global terrestrial biodiversity, and they provide livelihoods for over 2 billion people globally. So they are vitally important for a number of reasons. And one of our focuses on a policy level as a biodiversity, nature-focused charity is really to try to bring the dialogues at the international level on nature and climate together and see much more linkage between the COP processes for biodiversity and climate speaking to each other. We know that also the demand for wood is going to increase significantly if we're to meet the low carbon future that we need to meet, whether that's for green building or other timber uses. It's vital that this demand is met by sustainable forest management and does not create further pressures on biodiverse standing forest. And sustainably managed forests can act as that climate solution if stewarded and managed correctly. So why are we in this space as a conservation charity focused on nature? Well, obviously, our mission is a world where wildlife thrives, and that is inextricably linked with forest ecosystems and thriving forest ecosystems, both as a habitat for species and a source of climate sink for carbon emissions. Our work covers a lot of work globally on forestry, from our work in the Congo Basin to foster inclusive practices with indigenous peoples and local communities, working on agroforestry with smallholder communities in Thailand to tackle human-elephant conflict, enabling chemical testing to track down illegal timber flows with some excellent partners like World Forest ID, who are really trying to leverage new technology to tackle the illegal timber trade, but also through our SPOT platform, an ESG assessment platform focused on policies assessing timber companies. So we hope to play an important role both from our field conservation perspective and angle, but also as a scientific and academic research organisation.
My name is Josh Taylor. I'm Traceability Manager at ICEAL. If you don't know ICEAL, we're a non-profit. We work with standard setting organizations like FSC to deliver greater impact. So we do this through a combination of supporting and challenging these systems. On the support side, we convene 50 schemes as a learning community. So they exchange, they share, they learn from each other on good practice in how they're setting their standards, how they're measuring impact, how they're approaching assurance. We also promote collaboration and also innovation within these schemes. We've got an innovation fund that has over 60 funded projects focused on creating greater value for businesses, for certified producers, and delivering greater impact as well. We also work in challenging these initiatives. If you want to participate in our programs, there's an emphasis on continual improvement. We also have a compliance program for schemes that sets the bar on credible standard setting assurance claims. We have a big focus on research and evidence and implement the Evidencia platform. It's a one-stop shop for aggregating research on the impact of sustainability schemes like FSC to help stakeholders, whether you're a policymaker, you're a financial sector actor, you're a business, you're an NGO, navigate and better understand what can be pretty complex systems to understand their impact and effectiveness. My role at ICIL is really focused on supporting schemes like FSC, adapt and respond to changing stakeholder expectations around deforestation and conversion-free supply chains. Voluntary schemes like FSC, they translate complex regulation and bio requirements into more streamlined operational and implementable rules and systems. They don't replace corporate due diligence, but they can certainly provide the tools that companies and producers need to effectively implement their obligations. We also see a big shift in terms of performance measurement and linking to broader reporting frameworks as well among systems. What makes systems like FSC really interesting, at least for me, is the fact that they operate both within and alongside existing markets, and they also create new markets as well. So a standard, it can be great on paper, but if it's not taken up by producers, if it's not taken up by the supply chain, if it's not taken up by retailers and brands, its impact will be quite limited. So for this reason, I am incredibly excited to be moderating this discussion today and learning and exploring more about the business case for sustainable forestry and the role of the private sector in supporting and scaling sustainable forestry as well. So before jumping into this presentation, the conversation, we're going to start with a really exciting presentation from one of our panelists, Yuri, from Utrecht University, that dives into some of the benefits and research of sustainable forestry for nature and climate. So a round of applause for Yuri, come on up.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Yuri Zwerts. I'm an assistant professor at Utrecht University. I'm a wildlife biologist, and it's also important to say that I'm not financed by FSC, because we're going to explore the question whether FSC actually helps to conserve wildlife in tropical forest. My talk is called Protecting Elephants in the Hardware Store. Now, as a wildlife biologist, I'm particularly interested in tropical forest because tropical forests are hyper diverse. They cover only 7% of the land mass, but harbor over 62% of all the vertebrate species that we have on our land mass. And these remaining tropical forests that we still have are allocated for over 400 million hectares to logging concessions. That's an area twice the size of Mexico, a quarter of all our tropical forests. And all these forests are logged selectively. So that means that you make a road, you take out the most valuable species, and you leave the rest of the forest standing. And that is, of course, because there are hundreds of tree species per hectare, and not all these species are economically valuable or interesting to extract from these remote places. So forestry, through the eyes of a wildlife biologist like myself, is actually a low-impact form of land use and relatively benign if you compare it to deforestation related to other agro-commodities like palm oil, soy, other things. It adds value to the forest and it creates some work. But it's not all positive, of course. You also have to create roads, bring in people into previously remote areas, and together that creates hunting pressure. And especially in the region where I worked for many years, in the Congo Basin, you see roads here all over, and these are already secondary roads. There are even smaller roads branching out from these roads that cover the entire forest. So you open up the forest to hunting. And then in the Congo Basin, it looks generally like this. Any animal that you can think of, from snakes to primates to carnivores, will get hunted, snared, sold alongside of the road, taken away by traders to cities. And of course, that's a very unsustainable model, because it's a forest, it's not a production system. And you can see any species that you can think of, from pangolins to crocodiles to snakes, will be hunted. Now, FSC comes in and says, yeah, but we create these impacts, but we mitigate these impacts as well through our requirements. And I won't mention all of them, but they're generally not that difficult. It concerns blocking old logging roads, financing anti-poaching patrols, providing your teams with food instead of a gun, things like that. And then, yeah, you have the question, especially if you're a consumer in the hardware store and you look at that label, you think like, is this actually, is it worth something? Is it impactful? And of course, FSC says yes, because we do all these things, but they never really reliably showed that they also have an impact. And some other people tried. It's quite difficult because we always talk about very large scales, very heterogeneous landscapes. So there was a big knowledge gap that was identified many times, but not yet solved. And at the same time, consumers, legislators, the WWFs, traders want to know whether there is actually value in this certificate or not. So we got to work in a really ambitious study design in Central Africa. We paired 7 logging concessions that were FSC certified with local non-certified companies. So we always had a local comparison, but over the whole region, replicated over the whole region. And in all these concessions, we installed camera traps. So these are motion-triggered cameras that make photo of wildlife as it passes by, and it allows you to count the wildlife that lives in those forests. And of course, we had to take endless dirt roads to do that, and I didn't do that by myself. I got a lot of help from a lot of local field teams, endless local field teams. 263 locally recruited employees helped me with cutting the trails, carrying the camera traps, building the camps. And that, of course, yielded a lot of data. And now the images may be a bit dark because the screen is light, but I think it's visible to all right. This is my data. So, that's a giant pangolin. That's really dark. There's some chimps, forest buffalo, so you get primates, and aardvark even. More intimate moments in the forest as well. Gorilla, everything. And this is also a nice one, but it's a bit dark. It's actually a gorilla doing the chest beat. So that's pretty cool to have on camera. 1.3 million camera trap images in total. 55 mammals, species. You can imagine there was a lot of work to look at, but COVID broke out. We had a lot of students sitting at home doing nothing. So. All right, just because they're so nice and we all like wildlife, since we're here in the zoo, there's some very intelligent animals in the forest as well. And Jane Goodall just passed away, and she of course got famous showing that animals, chimps, use tools. Unfortunately, she showed it 40 years before I did, but so here's a chimp inspecting a camera. There are also other curious animals that are less subtle. So always fund a wildlife biologist. Okay, back to the question. Does FSC certified forestry help to conserve wildlife in tropical forest? Well, some box plots. I'm an academic, we love this. On the y-axis you see on the left graph all the wildlife that we observed per camera trap day. So all the species together. In the green box plot you see FSC certified sites. And on the red box plot you see the non-certified sites. And yes, there's also a significant difference. We see a lot more, 2.7 times more animals in FSC certified sites. Sounds interesting, sounds good, but actually it's not very convincing. Because these animals could also be rats and mice and species that are indicative of a degraded, hunted system. So we have to dive into this analysis a little bit further. At the same time, we did also record hunting signs, and we saw a lot more hunting signs in these FSC certified, in the non-certified sites. So that was promising. So how do we solve this issue of finding the real effect? well, we take weight as a proxy for hunting, because larger animals, they take an elephant out of a population every month and the population won't recover, it will go down. But if you do the same with mice, then it will recover. So if you split up all your observations according to weight classes, then that gives you a better impression of the hunting pressure. So we did that, and we have 5 classes from smaller than 2 kilograms up to larger than 100. And for the smaller species, we don't see a difference between FSC and non-FSC, and also not for 2 to 10 kilograms. But looking at the larger animals that recover more slowly, if there are human disturbances, if there is hunting pressure, things that you create by opening up the forest for logging, those animals are a lot more abundant in the forest that are FSC certified. So this was some very interesting result that made us very happy. You timed me, right? Still 2 minutes? No? Okay. Oh, great. We were really happy with this result, and it's also very convincing, right? Because it's exactly following the hypothesis. To answer the question, does FSC certified forestry help to conserve wildlife in tropical forests? Yeah, I can safely say our data shows convincingly that it does. I didn't look at particular measures, like which measure is most effective. I looked at the package, but I think that, financing anti-poaching patrols is very effective for elephants. Also, elephants particularly benefited a lot. Closure of all logging roads, just closing off the system that you open up, providing access to food in the logging camp so people and their families don't have to go out and hunt or rely on hunters. And of course, having an audited system. So being checked by a third-party company is very important. There are some business people in the room and they might not think it's a little investment, but a little extra investment really makes a difference. And of course, I didn't look at those. They were already shown by other studies, but there are also verified social impacts like worker safety, rights, and medical facilities related to FSC certified logging. Now, if you want to look at the details of this study, we got it published. It's openly available in Nature. We even made it to the cover, so that's it was quite a boost, I think, to the certified industry. And of course, after all the work, very nice. And if you think, that's very nice, a few more animals in the forest, but I don't really care. Maybe you should, because those animals in the forest, they of course have evolved with this forest, and they perform important functions for forest functioning, like seed dispersal and other things. And indirectly, that also affects us, because larger animals, they disperse larger seeds, and larger seeded tree species, they store more carbon. So in forests with larger animals, you see more carbon. And then elephants, they of course destroy a lot of trees, they eat a lot of small trees, and thereby they free up resources for larger trees that again store more carbon. So it has been shown in a study in geosciences that forests without elephants store 7% less carbon. Well, let's do some calculations. African tropical forests store on average 183 tons of carbon per hectare. Without elephants, that would be 170 tons a hectare. We have 220 million hectares of African tropical forest. Well, losing your elephants would mean losing 2.9 gigatons of carbon. That roughly equates annual emissions. This is, of course, a longer-term process. Annual emissions of India. Carbon has a price. Thinking about ecosystem services, very conservative price would be 15 euros a ton. Okay, very conservative. So you can't buy your carbon for 15 euros a ton anymore. That would mean that just protecting the elephants in the Congo Basin would yield you 43 billion euros. Sorry, I could have translated it to pounds. For protecting elephants. And that's also from an economic point of view, maybe for diversifying income streams of the forest that we're talking about, also a very interesting perspective, I think. My title slide said protecting elephants in a hardware store. And I think there are some hardware people here, right? Kingfisher is in the room as well. Hello. But we all know, next time when you're in the hardware store, we've given you or your fellow consumers the knowledge to make a conscious decision, because you can actually buy a piece of certified, FSC certified timber or non-certified timber, and with that decision, you basically choose for a forest full of chimpanzees, leopards, elephants, or a forest with a lot of rodents. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
So I'd also like to introduce the rest of my panel up. So first up, I've got David Hopkins from Timber Development UK. Please take the stage. We've got Charlie Bosworth from Miro Forestry, and also Julia Griffin from Kingfisher. So a round of applause for our panel. So brilliant. Thank you all for joining us. Let's start with just a round of introductions and also just to share about where you sit within the supply chain and kind of your role in this space. So Julia, if I can ask you to start.
Oh, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Julia Griffin, and I work part of the Kingfisher PLC. So we own the brands such as B&Q, Screwfix, Castorama, and Brico Depot. So we've got 1,900 stores across our estate, and we serve around 6 countries. We also have sourcing offices in the Far East, India, and Brazil. So currently we have around about 30,000 products that we purchase every year that have wood or paper. So this is a very important role for us. So I work as part of the central sustainability team, and I head up a small team that makes sure that we have products that are compliant to the Forest Positive policy. We ensure compliance to the numerous timber regulations that we have, whether it's UKTR, EUTR, and if we ever get the EUDR as well, and we do all of the reporting to the city. So I've been working with Kingfisher for over 20 years, so I've seen the challenges and the practicalities of trying to adhere a responsible sourcing policy and the challenges of sourcing that material.
Brilliant, thank you. So turning to you, Charlie, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi there, thanks. My name's Charlie Bosworth. I was one of the 2 founders of Miro Forestry and Timber Products. We're a West African-based plantation forestry and plywood business. We've got 20,000 hectares of forest we planted ourselves in 2 countries, in Ghana and Sierra Leone, and we grow fast-growing hardwoods, principally eucalyptus, acacia, Melina arborea, some Corymbia species, but all fast-growing hardwoods on a 7 or 8 year rotation, and we then harvest and replant, and that's the feedstock for our plywood production process. So we've got plywood mills, 1 in each country. We make all hardwood plywood types, so formwork plywood, melamine plywood for cabinetry, standard commercial plywood, and a range of other technical products. And we export those mainly into the Atlantic Rim markets, so EU, US, Middle East, North Africa, and we obviously serve as much as we can the West African markets too. We've been going for about 15 years. I do kind of strategy and business development for the group, a lot of commercial stuff, trying to build up new bits of the business. What else to say? We're at the other end of the supply chain to you, I guess. So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And last but not least, David, over to you to introduce yourself.
Thank you. So I'm Dave Hopkins, the Chief Exec of Timber Development UK. You know us as the Timber Trade Federation. We merged with TRADA, the Timber Research and Development Association, a couple of years ago to put a full supply chain organisation together in the UK. And one of our principal jobs is representing the timber importers in the UK and looking at all of the supply chains that then come in from around the world into the UK. The UK is a very large net importer. I think in terms of net stuff, we're the 2nd or 3rd largest importer in the world. And so we do a lot of work then interrogating those supply chains and developing the tools to make sure that our members can do active due diligence on all of those supply chains and make sure that when they're delivering goods to Julia and others, they have all of the requisite checks and balances in place to make sure that they've only bought goods from legal and sustainable sources.
Brilliant, thank you, Dave. So for this panel, we're going to be covering market needs and market demand. So really understanding what market needs are around sustainable forestry and demand for sustainable wood products. And then we're going to be exploring just some of the broader challenges and opportunities that comes in this space. It's pretty fast moving. We're going to try not to talk too much about UDR because it's, but I'm sure we'll touch on it. But we're very much in a kind of fast-moving space, so we're going to be looking at what is coming up, where some of the opportunities lie, and I guess where the market's shifting as we look towards hopefully a more sustainable future. But we'll start with market demand and market needs first. So my question to the panel is really just to explore what some of the day-to-day challenges and operational realities are of managing a business with a focus on sustainable forestry. And I guess how they differ from conventional forestry practices. So Charlie, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, sure, I can start. I mean, our type of forestry is obviously very different to what we've just seen in the presentation there. You know, we grow our timber from scratch. We're across the whole supply chain, so we raise seedlings in our own nursery. We have our own planting teams that plant the trees, our own harvesting teams that harvest the trees, and that obviously then goes to our own plywood mills. We're FSC certified, and what sustainability, I guess, means to us has been, you know, forward-looking, forward planning, multi-rotational land use planning, trying to make sure that as we've designed the plantations that, you know, they fit into, you know, quite strict environmental rules, you know, riparian buffer zones, making sure that we, you know, we're not converting any high conservation value forest. We try and respect and leave wildlife corridors, adopt a kind of mosaic land use pattern to make sure that we're leaving space for wildlife and flora and fauna. What else to say? I mean, you know, there's a lot of data to be captured, and so there's a lot of investment into systems and controls. But probably the most important thing for us is, you know, making sure that we've got social license to operate. Our community relations from the start have had to be very effective, very reactive, making sure that we, you know, involve the communities that we work with and amongst intimately into the project. And without that social license, you can't operate in our kind of environment. So that's what sustainability means to us. I would say it's part of running a responsible business. You know, most of what we've done, we wouldn't still be here if we hadn't done it. It's not really because we want to achieve a nice FSC stamp, though FSC do provide a great framework to work within, and you know they're very value adding. But we wouldn't exist if we didn't do those things anyway. It's part of responsible forestry. So yeah, I guess that's yeah. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe just drilling in a bit deeper on that, you mentioned about kind of the systems that you need to have in place, the planning that it takes to produce sustainably. I guess if we compare to conventional production practices, is there, like, how do you navigate that opportunity cost or for anything else?
I mean, well, what's conventional? I mean, less and less forestry, I guess, is being done in the way that, you know, we saw on the presentation. I mean, it's still, you know, a major problem, but I think more and more fibre comes from, you know, the plantation forestry. I think 7% or 8% of the world's forests are plantation forests, but they produce 47-48% of the world's fibre. So it's the way that timber products get delivered. Yeah, what was the question?
I guess it was just navigating the opportunity cost, because I guess it's, you know, there's challenges that are inherent with production.
I mean, I suppose we could we chase more profit and be less responsible? I guess
that's not what I'm promoting.
No. I'm just trying to say. I think we've just taken the view that long-term value will come from doing it responsibly. You know, sustainability isn't just a buzzword, it's how are you going to be there in 50 years' time, and we very much intend to be there in 50, 100 years' time. I think, you know, respecting riparian zones is an example, right? We could plant up the wet zones, we could, you know, destroy river zones and wetlands and plant a few more trees there, but honestly it would be a few more, and we'd just find it impossible to operate then. The communities would not like that, you know, our foresters wouldn't like that. And so it just wouldn't. Yeah, I'm not certain there is that much opportunity cost in what we've done. I think historically there has been in Indonesia, Malaysia. You know, there have been major clearances of, you know, rainforest to plant plantations, but that I think that happens less and less now.
I was just going to pick up on that point. When you look at the regulatory structures around the world, just to sort of reinforce Charlie's point, the opportunity cost is lost, actually, if you don't do the right thing, because most kind of import regulations, whether it's in the EU, the UK, US Lacey Act, Japan Clean Wood Act, all the different things, they all kind of work on a very similar basis and have similar criteria in place in order to meet them. So in order to access those international markets, you already have to have put in place a number of measures. Now, whether it's FSC or something else or whatever, you do have to have done all of those things. So if you are operating on a purely extractive model, you can't access the market. So your business is not sustainable financially. It's a one-off sale, maybe, but it's not an ongoing business, So to back up really what you're saying, you either do it like that or you're not in business.
Yeah, and I guess just on those different frameworks then, if I can turn to you, Dave, we're dealing with a fairly broad range of markets. We do see some alignment around common expectations around due diligence. From your experience and your vantage point in Timber Development UK, how do you see forest kind of producers navigating those expectations around data provision and the like?
It's a mixed picture, I would say, and it depends where you're coming from. We've actually found that the hardest place to get data from for the UK TR, for example, is out of Europe, because you don't have to provide data within Europe if you're part of the single market. So they mostly sell their goods within the single market. They don't like this small island off the coast asking them for data to prove that everything was done correctly and sustainably and responsibly and getting all the supply chain data. It is much easier, conversely, to get it from Ghana, for example, where those producers are quite used to saying, okay, well, I need to get all of this data, so I will get all of that. So you see different pictures in different places. And it's not to say that anything is being done wrongly in Austria or whatever. It's just that the companies there are really resistant, actually, to giving up the information that is needed when people are interrogating their supply chains. What you have seen, though, I would say as a general trend, is that forestry practice and regulation throughout the world has been on an upward trend. And, it's fits and starts, and different countries are at different stages and all those sorts of things. But, by and large, there is a great improvement in what is happening. Now, that's not to discount all of the things that we saw earlier about deforestation, hunting, illegal logging, all those things. It's still happening, but there is an improvement, I would say, in the general compliance with national laws, legal systems, and all the rest of it. And that the criteria within those national legal systems are getting better. Whether it's getting better at a rate that we would like to see is a different question, but certainly it is getting better. And companies are getting more and more used to the fact that if you want to sell a product, you will have to give up your data about all the things that happen within your processes, your supply chains, and so on. So it is just becoming kind of a standard business practice now.
Brilliant, thank you for that. And I guess, Yuri, just turning to you, as we heard, where you were doing your research, that wasn't necessarily reflective of main production practices, right? But I guess from your engagement with forest owners and producers, what were some of the challenges that they were encountering in trying to do the right thing?
You mean whether FSC reflected the main?
Yeah.
No, yeah. About 10% of the forests in Congo Basin are FSC certified, so that's not a lot. I just heard you say something about market premiums and that it's worth your effort.
I mean, we don't get a premium, I would say, for being FSC. I'd say it opens doors, though. I would say, we're a relatively new entrant to the market, right? We started making plywood 4 years ago in Ghana and last year in Sierra Leone. And, I'd say most of the conversations that we've had with EU buyers, we've had because we can say we're FSC certified, we're EUDR ready.
So it provides market access.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so general market premiums are lacking, especially for tropical timber. There are some additional costs managing your concession in a FSC certified way, so there are some definite challenges there. And I think the weakest aspect of FSC certified, implementation of FSC certification currently is biomonitoring. So providing the data that actually shows that you have an impact, that your biodiversity remains stable. And that's of course because biomonitoring is very expensive, and you need some specialized people, and it requires some investment in methods, and it's absolutely not the core business, of course, of these companies. So I think to alleviate these challenges, collaborations with NGOs like ZSL, WWF, WCS, Wildlife Conservation Society, they do that a lot also in the Congo Basin, collaborating with companies to actually invest together with the company in biomonitoring campaigns. And I think there could also be a role of governments there, because basically if you have a well-managed concession and you do provide that service of protecting biodiversity, then you're protecting national ecosystem services, right? So there could be a mutual interest in also seeking more partnerships there, I think. Yeah. Does that answer your question, or do we really go? Yeah, okay.
It does.
Right.
And I guess just, I think that point you raise around the challenges around monitoring, that's certainly something that we as ICL see as a challenge across certification schemes, because the reality is, particularly if you're looking at agricultural production or any of the different commodities that are being produced, the core of the business isn't providing data, it's providing a commodity or a service, right? So it's a little bit of a mindset shift to be now having to demonstrate compliance, providing a lot more data to back up what's happening. And
then also, what data are we talking about for EUDR? Yeah, of course, we're looking at deforestation, so loss of forest extent, which is quite easy to monitor, right? But if you look at impacts of selective logging, they are talking about forest degradation, and that's a whole other ballgame. So it requires going into the forest under the canopy monitoring. So the most low-hanging fruit there, I think, is simple standardization across ecoregions, landscapes, because now all the management units are still doing their own little monitoring campaigns, providing some photos of elephants that are not well thought through and not comparable to other concessions because they didn't follow similar protocols, for example. Yeah, and then it's a lost investment basically, and it's a pity because you can really use that data to look at population stability and all that. So standardizing that maybe could be an interesting role for an initiative from ICL. Yeah.
Thanks for giving me work.
Yeah.
But just Charlie, if I can come back to you then, as you mentioned about the systems that you have in place to demonstrate that you're doing the right thing. I guess do you see any other benefits or opportunities in leveraging that data for other services? Whether it's accessing finance, carbon markets, the range of things that are also looking for data.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the same data that's required for FSC certification and so on is obviously very relevant for, we're a large producer of carbon credits in the voluntary market, and it helps greatly there. I think in time, the market for kind of ecosystem services will be interesting to us as well. So I definitely see long-term benefits there. I mean, we're great believers in capturing data anyway, and so we try and put that at the heart of the business. But not all plantation forestry companies have the same resources that we do. I mean, we're relatively big now compared to many. So yeah, it's more tricky. And I totally agree. The more you can try and leverage and standardise and provide a solution that can be easily rolled out, just even easily understood. We're a forestry business. We don't necessarily know about how to take pictures of bushbuck and gorillas, and we have gorillas. But I think where the private sector can be helped by the NGOs or the governments can be in providing simple solutions that can be rolled out across the board. I totally agree with that.
I was also going to say about the data that you gather, as you alluded to, you can start to make the linkages then with other markets. Yeah. So you're already doing, making timber products and selling carbon credits. You could then look at all of the various kind of nature markets and ecosystem services and these sorts of things. But it's the same set of data, and it's kind of drawing that back to the same examples of monitoring or data points.
Brilliant, thank you all. So I think, yeah, we've heard about some of the challenges, some of the opportunities around sustainable production. Maybe we can move towards the demand side now. I'd be interested to hear about current market demand for sustainable sourced timber and what the market is really looking for. What's on trends? What are the pain points? What's actually in supply? So maybe, Dave, pass to you, given your role.
Okay, right now the market's looking for nothing at all, just survival, but it is quite tricky. I think you've got different markets for timber, and so they'll all go into slightly different places. So, and treating them all as one set of commodities is probably the wrong way to look at stuff. By and large, though, they're going to go into construction or interior design, furniture markets. That's the main home for timber and timber products. Stuff like you see on the walls here. And the trouble with going into the construction market is a very adversarial, price-driven, aggressive market where they want to drive down the price of the goods. And that then limits, with the sort of view towards standardisation within those markets, limits the variety of products that are going to get in. It's very much a price point driven market. One of the, not a criticism, but one of the kind of issues I think with certification within that market, and when you're talking about market access and getting a premium for your product, certification really took off with this kind of industrial plantations in Europe, the softwood plantations all over. It's a kind of it's a business management system which fitted well with businesses which were managed in exactly that way, particularly across Europe. And those ones easily took up certification until it became the norm. Yeah. It wasn't the norm, and it still isn't the norm across a lot of the tropical belt. But if you're a buyer in construction, which is very aggressive and very price point driven, and you can buy alternative products, things like MDF instead of tropical timbers and all these sorts of things, you just take it as standard. And so if somebody hasn't got an FSC or a PFC certificate with their product, you're not going to buy it. But if they have, you see no difference between that and, because it has become standard and commonplace within all those other markets. And I do think that something needs to, I don't know what the answer is there, but I do think that has become a bit of a problem in terms of getting a premium for products. But I also think that narrow focus within the market you're selling into on price and standardisation has actually excluded a lot of other products. That's not to say that the products they're buying are not sustainable or not well managed and don't come from well managed sources, and are using a lot of recycled and reused fibre in panel products and all this sort of stuff. It's a good story wherever it's coming from, but I do think it's excluding, sadly, a lot of tropical goods which simply because of price points and other issues in there. And it means that you're not getting the premium for the product and for the work that you're putting into it.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you, Dave. Maybe, Julia, if I can turn to you, from Kingfisher's view, what does the market look like? And I guess, what are you looking for in terms of the products that you're sourcing?
I can imagine, as you know, we've been on this journey for a long time, since the early 90s. So we're starting with a timber policy in the early 90s and then helping to found FSC. So this has been very much a core part of our business for the last, since the 90s. I mean, we are seeing demand grow, as Dave says, for construction, growing specifically for sustainable source timber. I mean, what we did, and this was a business choice, we did choice editing. So we made the significant choice to just only source certified material and or recycled. So we took that on as a responsibility. So when customers were coming into the store, we had done all of that for them. It does have challenges now because of the landscape that we're living in with the war that's going on with Ukraine, Russia. There's price points, as you've alluded to, there's availability. I mean, we do still strive to get certified material at all the time, but we know there is a lot more that we could do to maybe help support those companies or those forests that aren't certified that want to have that market access. I mean, the changing market, I think, is also because the demand is, certainly from our company point of view, is for the net zero goals, because we are very much now focusing on, as a business, you know, our carbon, scope 3 emissions, and then you've got also what we're thinking about is, well, we've been on this journey for a long time, and we're now nearly at 100% compliance to our forest positive policy, which means that all of our products that we purchase are certified or recycled. But now businesses have to think about beyond what certification is, thinking about ecosystem services, looking at biodiversity, looking at carbon, and the amount of regulations that are coming down the road, CSDDD, CSRD, and EUDR, etc. I mean, it's always been a core part of our business, and I think the demand is a challenge. It's certainly with the way the market is right now, and hopefully it will get better.
Brilliant, thank you. And if I can just drill in a bit, you mentioned about just the range of pressures, reporting obligations that you're facing. To what extent are offerings like voluntary schemes helping you comply and report against these obligations?
Yeah, they absolutely do help. You know, these voluntary schemes. I mean, from a customer's perspective, it also brand reputation, but it's also it meets our requirements in terms of policy compliance. It is very much driven by the needs of customers. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And maybe if I can go back to you, Dave, from the companies that you work with, do you see similar? Do they feel that the systems and offerings that are on the market and that are available today, do they feel like they're supporting them with these kind of suite of new obligations that they're facing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that if you look at even things like EUTR and UKTR, one of the best ways of meeting your obligations is to buy certified products. So the regulation as it is written says that you have to reduce your risk to negligible of all the goods, and you have to interrogate your supply chain. So when you're filling in your forms, they say, what have you done to mitigate your risk? I've bought certified product. Okay, so that gets you a hell of a lot of the way down the whole due diligence procedure, because it shows that you are meeting your risk obligations. It also then meets a lot of the criteria for a range of other obligations that are coming in, whether it's kind of corporate reporting obligations, deforestation things. The criteria that they put in there are the criteria kind of behind the label. And I do think, and I'm going to push it out at the certification companies, that they should do more to say what is behind those labels, about what those criteria are, because they're good. And I know it's lazy shorthand to look for the logo and that sort of thing, but actually people do want to know the information now, and it is helping a lot for a number of different areas of corporate reporting.
Yeah, I think, and just to touch on that, I think what we're seeing as well, certainly from our consumers, is traceability. That is becoming more and more. People want to know where things come from. But there's also business opportunities there as well, because you're getting closer to your supply chain and you're seeing the opportunities of where you could make an impact on the ground, and also maybe resourcing where there's some challenges as well.
Yeah.
Super interesting, thank you. Charlie, do you know, in terms of the buyers that you have, do they seem happy, or, you know, what are they looking for, I guess?
Well, I mean, we're obviously quite, we sell B2B, right, when we're not selling it to any customers, and so it really differs in different markets. I mean, in EU markets and US markets, there's certainly, we get asked a lot about FSC, and it's a door opener. You know, in Middle Eastern markets, in North African markets, and West African markets, you know, there's no knowledge really of FSC, and so it doesn't get us anywhere. Even in the EU and US, we still have to compete on price. I mean, you know, if we go along and say we're FSC certified, they'll say that's great, but you're $30 a cube more expensive, and so sorry. So it's still tough, and I think it's a door opener, but no more than that in terms of where we are. I think that it's one of the challenges with the timber market is that you're so distant from your customer, from your end user. There's so many steps in the supply chain. You know, we typically sell to wholesaler importers. You know, someone who can buy 20 containers of plywood. They'll often be selling then on to 5 or 6 different distributors in their end markets, and there might be more steps in the supply chain before it gets close to a shop where someone's going to buy a piece of plywood. Yeah. And so, you know, the traceability is, you know, I think customers do want traceability, but it's just so hard to deliver that when the supply chain is so complicated. And it's hard for us to access our customers. You know, we've been trying to understand better what are our actual end users, the guy building something or the lady building something. What do they want from their plywood? But it's really hard to find them because we're so far from their, you know, it's difficult.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that, right? Because we think about traceability as being tracking product from kind of production through to the end retailer, but there is such a need and a value in that information flow back the way as well. Yeah. Right? And that transparency of who's actually ultimately buying your products.
100%. Yeah. I think it's really interesting, you know, speaking to people about my job and what I do, you realise a lot of people don't have very much knowledge of where their timber comes from. You know, the difference between a piece of Iroko and a piece of eucalyptus. I was talking to a carpenter friend of mine who said, what's the difference? You know, they're both FSC certified. And you think, wow, the difference in terms of the forestry practices to get, you know, the Iroko and the plantation euc is just so different. But he is a carpenter, he didn't know. And I thought that's just really interesting. I think there's just less public awareness of how our wood gets delivered to, you know, to our desks or our chairs or whatever, than there would be for, you know, the mining industry is quite easy to understand in a way, whereas I think, timber's quite varied, isn't it? I mean, it's very varied.
Yeah. Though I would say if you ask the mining people, they will say that they have very complex supply chains.
Sure, yeah.
And it's a reputation problem, right? So for tropical timber, everybody always thinks like, okay, logging, bad, we lose the Amazon, we lose tropical forest. But conservationists actually see logging, well, if it's done well, as a conservation tool, right? So, yeah.
And there's a huge range, right? I mean, you can do selective logging in a very rapacious and terrible way, and you can do it in a way that's actually great for those forests. It's making them, to some extent, if you make them a commercial asset that's got value, it's going to protect them sometimes. And I think the same is true of plantation forestry. I mean, we're trying to be as responsible as we can, but you can do it in a terrible way if you don't have that framework. And so it's complex.
Brilliant. Thank you. Super interesting. I think, Dave, I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned around the need for alternatives or something else, right? So we've got certification, we've got standards, we've got labels as kind of BAU now, or getting that way. What does that step up look like? And I guess, are any other systems, or whether that's national or whether that's otherwise, that you see emerging that can take that extra step?
Yeah, I think the point I was trying to make was with certification, it has worked very well for those places where it's worked very well. I think if you ask why do you have a certificate on a product, it's because it's compensating for a lack of regulation from the state or a national body or whatever. And we have a kind of a business mentality which is calling for deregulation across lots of markets. If you look at most construction products, whether it's timber or anything else, it looks like a kid's bloody swimming trunks. There's a badge to cover a load of different things. There's loads and loads of different private sector things for all of the different areas and things that company has done to compensate for a lack of regulation that business sector has actually called for, and then they have to go through all of these hoops to do, which is a little bit ridiculous. What we're seeing more of, and what and it came up actually here a couple of years ago when we had an event here on sustainable finance for different businesses, and there was this gap where you have businesses which are doing fantastically well, putting in place sustainable practices, sustainable business practices, and there were examples on this stage of fishing and forestry and agriculture and all these different things, and they could get so far with their business development, but they weren't certified within their own kind of business verticals, because the banks wouldn't recognise them as being certified, and they have a policy saying we're only going to invest, according to our ESG policy, in the most sustainable things. That needs certification, you don't count, and that was that business over. And we see that a lot in different countries with forestry practices. What we are seeing more and more now is strengthening of national sustainable forestry systems. We've seen it in Ghana with the FLEG licence that's just come out. I think it's really good. It shows you get a licence with, there's a standard set for national forestry practice within Ghana. It's not a voluntary measure, it is a mandatory compliance thing, and you can argue whether it's, where it sits against certification. For me, that's not the point. There is a standard in place, it's mandatory to comply, everyone complies. From an importer's point of view, you have a system in place, you get a certificate with your goods, and it's got all of the information that you need to kind of meet, to show that it's met all the regulations within that country. It's got a QR code with a traceability back to the place of origin. Fantastic, it meets lots of things. That should be somehow recognised by financial institutions as a green light to go and invest there, as then saying this has very safe regulations across the whole of the forestry estate in this country. It's a great place to go and invest in companies like Miro or whatever. And I would like to see some, I don't know what the mechanism is for recognising that, but those pathways which show the criteria for sustainability somehow need to be recognised in markets, because there's a lot going on. It's not an entirely bad news story when you look across lots of different countries, and the things that are being put in place and the things that are being done are very good, and they sort of need to be done at a national level. It needs to be recognised somehow so that there is a pathway up. Now, if it's a pathway towards certification or it's a pathway towards something else, whatever it is, there needs to be that recognition, because if there isn't a sort of an incentive to carry on doing that right thing, what's the incentive to keep that forest? What's the incentive to keep doing it right? And that's really what I'm getting at.
Yeah, no, brilliant. Thank you, Dave. And that's a lovely segue for next question, which is just really around how we scale sustainable forestry. How we overcome some of the challenges that we've faced. And I think your point there around legal compliance and strengthening compliance at the national level is certainly one of the ways to do that. Likewise for building more of a business case and getting more investment in to reward better practices. But I'd be interested to hear from the panel just on, I guess, where we still see barriers and how we can collaborate to overcome some of those barriers to scale sustainable forestry. So I don't know who would want to start.
A thing or two. I'm a bit reluctant. I see your point. There has to be a path up, right? And totally agree. But yeah, it all depends on how compliance is assessed, right? So we're also talking about countries that have complex and challenging governance structures and high corruption indices, and those are also realistic characteristics of these playing fields. So. I would be reluctant to I think it should be a door opener indeed, like having some national standard that is assessed at least. But I would be reluctant to put it at the same level as these independent private certification schemes. Again, I'm not financed by FSC, but there's a real difference in legality and, for example, FSC certified forestry, in terms of going the extra mile also for biodiversity and things like that. That is often not incorporated in these national standards. But yeah, it's a good first step, but yeah, also to not get over enthusiastic yet. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Either of you want to go next?
So what was the question? How do we scale sustainable forestry?
Yeah, so I guess it's overcoming barriers.
I mean, for me, I think sustainable forestry means very different things in different contexts, right? I mean, protecting the sort of forest that we saw in the presentation, is just so important. And for me, the reason I got into what we're doing is I think a big piece of the puzzle has to be more plantation forests providing our fibre, so that we put much less pressure on, and frankly, selective logging. I've been to a few forests, even the ones that claim they're FSC certified, doing it truly sustainably. I don't know, how often do you think that happens? I mean, is that...
hopefully in all FSC certified
Yeah,
forests.
yeah.
Because they're audited
But
by
it's hard,
third-party
right?
companies, but there are, of course, corrective actions, reports and things like that, and
Yeah.
companies sometimes,
I mean, my view is to try and scale plantation forests so that the majority of the fibre that we humans need will come from farms, timber, where you can have a much closer monitoring and protect the huge biodiversity value of the remaining forests. How you do that, I don't know, but that's what I think you've got to do. And how can that scale? Where can that scale? The traditional locations of most plantation forestry in Latin America or in Asia, they can grow in terms of productivity, but there's not much more space in terms of area. So for me, a lot of it's got to happen in Africa. That's why we're there.
You'd agree? You're nodding.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, and I agree. I agree with what you're saying, Yuri. I'm not trying to put everything on a pedestal. It's just about recognising where good work exists and finding a pathway that can allow that to scale. Do you see what I mean? And allowing that money to be invested in a business, which may not be certified, but that can then grow, because it's only when they've got the money that they can pay for the certification. Do you see what I mean? The two things are completely interlinked. So you need to sort of find some mechanism for doing that. And I think somehow, some of the things that you've already talked about getting the data, finding those linkages between other markets which exist, nature-based solution markets, ecosystem services, carbon markets, all of this sort of stuff, which can provide another layer of finance into those businesses, is a good start, at least.
Yeah, I think the key, blocker is finance. That is the biggest thing for us. I mean, what we used to do, when I worked for B&Q, is they had schemes like the WWF Producer Group, the Forest Trust. These were companies that were actually working on the ground with forests to get them to a point of being able to be certified, but they don't exist anymore. So it's just about how we have that access to these kind of companies that are looking to have that market access, that we're willing to work with to get them to the point of where they can be certified. I think it's such a shame, because that was really a big development piece for us, is to try and encourage more companies to be certified, but also giving them the access to that market to be able to invest, which is not, I don't see it now.
And I guess it can't be taken as a given in the future, right? So it's just emphasizing this need for investment. Yeah. I am being warned that we need to move on to our final question before we go to questions from the audience. So just to loop us back to what Ollie was saying, we're on the path towards COP30. Forests are taking very much centre stage at the COP. I'd be interested to hear perspectives on how sustainably managed forests can contribute most effectively to global climate and biodiversity goals. So I don't know who wants to start. Yuri, maybe?
Not necessarily.
But you look so keen.
I think that with anything like this, there needs to be someone, and there is a total absence of this in the world at the moment. There needs to be some degree of political leadership, somebody who's willing to stand up and say, forests are a good thing. Yeah. They suck down carbon, they provide biodiversity, they get, all these different other services that we have. They create the weather. All of the rainfall that you'll see in the Sahel or wherever it is, that is kind of created in the Congo Basin. All these different examples. Somebody needs to be there to lead that, and it does require some degree of political leadership to start with. The financial case needs to be made over and over again, but that needs to be made to those politicians, and they need to understand it. And that's two different things. I think the case is often made, but the understanding is not there. And the money isn't there. The markets that could provide that finance are kind of lacking. We've talked a lot. I was very excited about the carbon market 28 years ago. And when the Kyoto Protocol was signed, and we were like, yeah, this is going to be the thing. And that hasn't, there is still a lot of money moves through that, but where does it move to, and what does it finance, and that sort of thing is still lacking. And the nature side and the sort of natural systems is still lacking. But for kind of the COP30 side, I do think it's got to be some degree of political leadership. I don't know where that exists, and if somebody can point me towards someone, that would be really useful. I'll vote for them.
I mean, just looking at the carbon markets, right? I mean, we produce voluntary credits under the Verra system, and we typically have been selling them at between, in the last, let's say, 18 months, $15 and $25 a ton, right? But in the compliance markets, I mean, what's the price of a ton of carbon these days? I mean, $90, $100, probably more. The arbitrage is massive, and I think if there was more political will to drive, more, to open up carbon markets to businesses like ourselves, I mean, that would transform what we could do, transform it. It would finance huge plantation development. And so, that's one mechanism that could happen, but the only way you get there is you have to charge consumers for the, you've got to charge more for carbon, and people don't want to do that. So it's a very difficult political problem. I mean, one success story, right, I would say, is if you look at Vietnam, go back 20 years, the Vietnamese forestry industry was tiny. It's now, I think, the largest. Is it the largest exporter of wood products? I think if you include wood chip in the world. It's transformed both the country, the economy, industry there, and what the Vietnamese government did was they basically got out of the way. They decided they weren't going to try and charge fees and tariffs and taxes and imposts on farmers selling their logs. They were going to support industry. They supported the timber processing side of the industry so that there were good mills that could access European, US markets, that were producing good products that could then pay good money to the farmers for logs, and that has driven an explosion in smallholder forestry. The majority of Vietnam's fibre supply comes from smallholders, comes from communities who are growing the logs on short rotations, and there's millions of hectares now of acacia and lots of eucalypts. And the same is true in China. There's 5 million hectares of eucalypts planted principally by smallholders and communities. And it's industry that's driven that. It's being able to pay ready money for logs that farmers think, well, I'll do that, I'll plant up my land because I'll get money for that. And I think if governments can support that and provide industry with the ability to grow, I think that will drive the development of plantation forestry. And if nothing else, that's a solution to where's a lot of the fibre going to come from. It's not a simple solution, but it's pretty much got to be the only solution. The only other solution is get it from the natural forests, and that's a disaster. So, for my money, look at countries like Vietnam and China and try and look at what was successful there. That's what we're trying to do, at least in a small way, in West Africa.
Brilliant, thank you.
I can say a word or two on biodiversity then. Of course, carbon is fungible, so carbon credits are worth the same everywhere at any moment. But for biodiversity, that's of course a lot more complex because you can't really compare like a biodiversity credit here and there. And the main challenge for biodiversity valuation is also biomonitoring. So again, there are real opportunities there for standardized monitoring across landscapes to show that forest managers really contribute to wildlife populations in a certain context, and then that can be marketed either to I'm not a big fan of offsetting, but for donors also to see that there is an actual impact from their donations. You also see that happening now in the north of Congo. There are logging companies that have partnerships that actually pay for the biodiversity that they protect, also partly based on the work that we did. That shows that these companies really do a good job protecting critically endangered animals, and the private sector apparently is willing to pay for that. For reputational gains so far, but there are some market opportunities there. Yeah, but the challenge is impact evaluation again. Yeah.
But I guess to your point earlier, there is a lot of innovation happening in this space, right? So it's more possible than ever to be able to measure.
There's so many nice innovative developments in semi-automated methods that can easily standardize monitoring pipelines, and there's a lot of cool stuff happening. Also, ZSL is contributing to that tremendously. Yeah.
Yeah, just one of the things I was just thinking about the question. I think the questions that we get asked, I get asked regularly in the business is, what is the value of the certification? Looking at it, ecosystem services, biodiversity and carbon, and that's a strong desire, but they're looking at it from a monetary point of view. So that seems to be the driver, but being a corporate business as well. we've done all of this good work, but what does it actually mean on the ground? Not just from a monetary value, but also from an ecosystem services point of view and the biodiversity. They like to say, well, we've put all this effort and investment in, what has it driven as well? And I agree with everything that Dave said about what is actually needed for COP30. Somebody there. I mean, we are all here today because we are very passionate about this particular subject, but it's just how we resonate that at COP30 to make everybody the same.
For sure. Thank you very much for that. So we're going to wrap up the panel now, and we're going to move to audience questions. So if you have urgent questions for Yuri that you've been sitting on for the past age about the pictures that he had from his presentation, or if you want to ask about any of the topics that we discussed today, whether that was around traceability, finance, market access, we've got a little bit of time for questions. So please feel free to raise hands.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion. My name's Andrew Heald. I work for a company called Innovaland. I was just thinking FSC's 30 years old today, and some of the things we've been discussing, we seem to have been discussing for most of those 30 years. I was just thinking in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, what things do the panel think we'll be discussing about certification and forest products and monitoring?
Anyone like to?
EUDR?
I was going to say the same things. Yeah. I don't know. I would like to think that it would moved on, that there would be more coverage, frankly, across, particularly across the tropical world, and people would see that. Do I believe that? Well, tricky to say. It is very difficult. I think that it's one of these things that could have a lot of different shocks in the system. But I would like to think that with movements like the EUDR, when you start putting these similar pressures onto other commodities, which is one thing that we don't talk about here, is that the forests don't exist in a vacuum, and the timber industry doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are a whole range of other activities going on, particularly agricultural clearance and agricultural expansion for obvious reasons. And if you can put the same sort of due diligence pressures on all of those other commodities, which is what the EUDR was kind of, in theory, going to be doing, I do think that can change the game. And I do think that if we can spread the same pressure that we put on ourselves onto all of those agri-commodities and onto mining and stuff like this, then we may be in a very different place and we may see a very different world in 30 years. But who knows?
I would hope ecosystem service certification would be a bigger topic, and also climate adaptation and protection from climate change. I think forestry, we'll need to work on that as well. I think it's going to be crucial for your plantations as well, right? So, and I had another one, but
I mean, we would love to see ecosystem services become a revenue stream for us, because we've been there where we are for 15 years now, and hopefully in 10 years we'll be in there for 25 years. And our forest managers and our staff and our local communities know a very great deal now about the specifics of the environment that we're in. We know how to interact with it, and where to look, where to monitor. It would be great to be able to deliver that as a service and demonstrate that we're having a beneficial impact, because we absolutely are, but we just don't get paid for it. And it would be great to get paid for it, but there needs to be a mechanism, and we can't deliver that on our own.
And then landscape certification. So maybe it won't ever work, but we've heard the gap in finances a couple of times, and I think that could be a solution if you really put different stakeholders together, different industries perhaps, create good benefit sharing mechanisms, and create an investable entity that could open up investments in, for example, tropical forest landscapes that don't get these investments at this point.
And just to say on that, we are seeing a bigger move towards landscape and jurisdictional approaches, and some maturity and some better understanding, I guess, about what they can deliver and what they can't, which obviously helps build markets and build confidence as well. Julia, any final?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I sincerely hope we've moved on in 10 years' time, because I feel like we've been talking about the same thing for the last 10 years. So I sincerely really hope that we're way more advanced in 10 years' time. That's my view. You know, what that will look like, who knows, as the group says, but I sincerely hope with the passion of people like us, we can make a difference.
Brilliant. Thank you for that question. We have time for one more before we all get pulled off stage with the hook. So, oh, we have two at the front. You can pick. I'm not getting involved in that.
Hi there, Jemima Jewell from Kronos Sustainability. Thank you for a great discussion. I wanted to ask the panel about barriers to certification or indeed to legal compliance. Appreciate you've talked a little bit about the challenges that some smaller producers and processors can face in terms of investment and capacity. What are the barriers, I guess, particularly from the demand side, that you see for larger companies to actually be FSC certified or to be able to comply with regulations? Because, you know, not everybody is. So what are the reasons why more aren't, given that we've talked about that as being a kind of access to market question, we've talked about all the benefits, what's stopping others?
Tricky. I'd say most of the sort of, like, in terms of actual like product producers, sawmills, panel producers, and companies, like Kronospan, have certification, and the majority have like dual certification of PEFC and FSC, particularly the ones who are selling into the UK or into the European market. There's very, very few that don't. There are a few smaller sawmills, I would say, dotted around Europe that just don't bother, feel they don't need it, selling into less regulated markets. So if you're selling into construction, there will be procurement rules in place which sort of dictate really the certifications and things that you need. So your company will be excluded from that market if you don't. If you're just selling fence posts and stuff in rural areas, then perhaps you're never going to be asked and you're never going to bother, but your business is never going to go to scale. For the larger companies, though, I don't see that there should be that many barriers to compliance, and I don't know of many companies, certainly within our world, that they might complain about compliance. We get a lot of that. But that doesn't mean that they're not compliant or that they're not doing all the things to meet the rules that they need to comply with. Certainly that they've got this, most of them have their certification in place, or forms of certification. Doesn't stop them also complaining about that, but that most of them are doing it. So I don't know what the barriers are. There's a lot of barriers within the regulations that exist about movement of goods and trade and things, particularly as regards things like Northern Ireland, and let's not go there. But the actual regulations and the certification, most of the bigger companies now are meeting that, I would say.
I mean, from our perspective, certainly for over the last 20 years, I think the barrier from our perspective is knowledge. It's the understanding of what's required. So I've spent many times on discussing with vendors about certification, how do you get it, and even just down to the latest regulation, because they seem to have a knowledge gap, or they don't know where to start. So it's not always necessarily the finance, but it's the knowledge, and whether they've got the skill within their business to be able to undertake certification, because sometimes that's lacking. So you end up having to kind of teach them and show them how to get certification and take them on that journey. So I think for me it's more knowledge, not necessarily finance, certainly for the ones that we speak to on a regular basis.
I would also say the red tape and the complexity of it all. I think that's a real challenge for FSC to simplify their systems. I've never certified a business, but I heard from many businesses that PEFC is a lot easier. And I'm not saying their requirements should simplify, but their processes should. And I think that's going to be crucial for engaging all these smaller companies.
I mean, just as a sort of aside, that FSC is trying, I think, and they're creating new for instance, umbrella schemes whereby many smaller producers can be certified under the umbrella of a single scheme. And from our perspective, we were contacted very early by FSC with regards to EUDR, actually, to try and bring EUDR and FSC certification kind of in line. So I think I think the motivation is there. I think that is recognised, but it's hard work, isn't it? I mean, it's just really hard.
It's complex.
It's complex.
Complex to build a scheme that meets everyone's needs, right?
Yeah, very.
So with that, I'm going to draw this panel to a close. But a very big thank you to everyone for the questions and to our panel. Julie, Dave, and Julia. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Good afternoon and welcome back to the forum and our second session, which will be all around finance for forests. I'm Bridget Adams. As Ollie said, I'm from ZSL's Sustainable Finance team. But this year I'm also a youth fellow with the High-Level Climate Champions, where we're working with the COP30 presidency to deliver the action agenda at this year's conference in Belém. Within this action agenda, we have a key objective, which is all around investments to halt and reverse deforestation and forest degradation. So I'm really looking forward to moderating today's discussion. It's very relevant, particularly with COP just around the corner. Before I invite our panelists up, I'd just like to first set the stage. This has already been done pretty well for me by the previous panel, where we talked a lot about finance. But I'd also like to set the stage in terms of what is the current state of forests and finance for them. So 2 days ago, the Forest Declaration Assessment for 2025 was released. This is a coalition of organisations. ZSL contributes to this, and it's released every year to do an assessment of where forests are against the Glasgow Declaration for Forests and Land Use. What this year's report says, it's pretty sobering, and I would really encourage everyone in this room to go and have a look. But it found that over 8 million hectares of forest was lost in 2024. That's a rate that's 63% higher than where we need it to be to achieve deforestation, to halt deforestation by 2030. The report highlights a key imbalance in terms of finance, where we have harmful subsidies outweighing green ones by a rate of 200 to 1. And this means that we're investing far more in forest destruction than we are in sustainable practices. And while we're seeing large commitments from governments, corporates, and the financial sector in terms of ambitious pledges, the report highlights that delivery and transparency is still lagging. That's my sobering piece. But we're all here to talk about what the solutions are, and we've got a great panel that are working on investments in those sustainable practices, and we'll be delving into how we can scale these. So the question really today is, how can we transform and utilize finance in a way that turns this piece around and ensures that we do reach those targets by 2030? So to begin unpacking that question, I'm going to invite our first panelist, Karen Patterson from FSC, to share a bit of a presentation around their new approach to assessing impact within forest investments and how that relates to finance.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about FSC verified impact. This is to demonstrate the intrinsic value of forests beyond just wood products. So a little bit of background about FSC. You've all heard about it, so thank you to the previous panelists. So we have been around, as was previously stated, 30 years. This is our 30th anniversary. Some facts and figures on here. We have over 160 million certified hectares are globally. Within the UK, we are recognised by over 70% of the population, and certification is held by 50 of the top global retailers in the world. That's just a little bit of a background. We set up to do the right thing for forests as a forest management organisation, and in the last few years we have decided to go beyond that to try and harness those intrinsic ecosystem services that are inherent in forests. So, we all know forests have hidden superpowers. Over 30% of the land's surface is covered in forests, which support over 80% of terrestrial species. And as was previously mentioned, nearly 2 billion people's livelihoods depend on it. But I would probably say more than that in terms of the soils, the air quality, fresh water. All of these are renewable within forests, and we must protect them, which is where verified impact comes in. So our solution is, it's a collaborative approach, so it's linking forest managers with potential sponsors. So what the forest managers are trying to do is to sustainably manage their forests to deliver these ecosystem services. They produce high quality data, which is all part of the verification, which is independently audited. And that verification can be given to companies if they want to disclose, for example, CSRD. And then, again, this advances forest management. So it's almost a little circle of the more sponsorship going in, the more outcomes you're going to get. So it benefits both companies and forest managers. So these are the ecosystem services that we have. Now, I think everyone should understand what an ecosystem service is, but just to go over it, it's basically the services, whether it's biodiversity, carbon, soil, recreation, water, and the two additional ones we've added, cultural services and air quality, that deliver for humankind, basically. So without these forests, we wouldn't have all of these services being delivered. So what are the benefits? It's high integrity data, it's independently audited, you have that backing of a completely independent organisation auditing all the forests. Forest managers have to produce data to prove that what they're doing is actually delivering. So this can all be used in sustainability reporting. You can use it to track progress with SBTNs. It's also a good thing to have. So if you want to invest in a forest that has verified impact, it's a good thing to sell for your brand. Everyone's looking for that competitive market, and verified impact can provide that storytelling through social media, which is all important at the moment. And it's showing that beyond value contribution. You might be doing everything to make sure your product is sustainable, but what additionality can you add to that? And you're building your trust brand. Many Gen Z people, at the moment we've been doing recent surveys, and basically the Gen Z community want that additionality. They want to know that there's the brand is sustainable and they are doing everything they can to protect Earth's resources. So just an example of one of our projects in the UK. So this was our first verified impact forest on the Isle of Mull. It's a project through the Mull and Iona Community Trust, so it's a charitable organisation. And what they did was they wanted to basically create an opportunity for local communities by restoring and protecting the rare Atlantic rainforests. I mean, we've been talking about tropical rainforests. Atlantic rainforests are far rarer across the UK, and there is an aim to kind of restore these. So what they did was they bought up some plantation forest, and they've been gradually restoring it back to its native forest. They're conserving priority habitats and restoring those degraded habitats. And what they're doing also is, as part of the whole kind of ethos of the project, is to involve the local community. So connecting the individuals, communities. They have a forest school, they bring in students to come and observe, to volunteer. And Mull, if anyone's ever been there, there's not a huge amount to do on Mull, so it's a really good area to kind of bring in communities so that they can connect with each other. Some communities feel quite isolated, so this is a natural place for people to come. They're also starting to do natural flood management. They are working with neighbouring landowners to try and connect and restore habitat across the area. In addition, we've got 2 recently verified forests, one up in Yorkshire and one in South Wales with the Woodland Trust. And they are, again, doing the same thing, but they are going for soils and water in terms of the ecosystem services to try and reduce flood risk, to improve water quality. And then just a little bit about one of the sponsors that sponsors a verified impact forest. This is La Française des Jeux, which is the French National Lottery. So they wanted to go beyond sustainability. They already make sure that all their tickets and scratch cards are FSC certified. So what they wanted to do was, they've got a strategy to support biodiversity restoration. So they're supporting a forest in France with a 10-year commitment to restore all the natural characteristics within that forest, and they want to go on and do more of that. So that's just one of the reasons why a sponsor will do this. Other reasons can be, as I said, part of their CSRD. Also, companies can sponsor because they want their staff to get involved in a forest. They want to see, they might be material dependent on one of the ecosystem services. So you might get the staff to come in, do some volunteering, make them understand much better about why the company wants to be so sustainable. And that's me. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. That was great, and really looking forward to discussing it more in the panel discussion. So I invite the rest of our panellists up to the stage. We've got Toby Lewis Donaldson from the Dutch Development Bank, FMO. Welcome. Tim Steinweg, Head of Stewardship for Nature at Principles for Responsible Investment, and Amerigo Mello, Manager for ESG at the International Woodland Company. Thanks, everyone, and thank you for being here. Before we dive in, we'll start with some introductions from the rest of our panellists. So we'll start with Toby, and then Tim, and then Amerigo, if you can introduce yourself, and then a bit about your work and where it sits within finance for forests.
Sure, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Toby Lewis Donaldson, and I work for FMO. FMO is the Dutch Development Finance Institution, or DFI. So if you're not familiar with what a DFI is, we invest for development impact as well as for financial return. We manage have about 15 billion assets under management. So relatively big in the DFI context, but relatively small in the context of the global financial system. We have our own balance sheet, and then we also manage public funds. So we have funds that we manage on behalf of the UK government, the Dutch government, and the European Commission. And my job is working on one of those funds. It's called Mobilising Finance for Forests, or MFF. It's a 300 million fund, and its purpose is to invest in any businesses that protect and restore tropical forests. So we can offer concessional debt, we can offer equity, we can offer what we call a development contribution for early stage financing, and we can offer technical assistance. So it's a complete sort of blended finance facility that we have, which we try and blend with our own balance sheet investment, and ultimately all with the purpose of mobilising private finance for forest protection, because I said we're relatively small, and so we always aim to be catalytic and always have that view when we're investing as well. So my job is I work on our development contribution facility primarily, so we can deploy early stage financing, ticket sizes of about 500,000 to 2.5 million to projects. These are in the form of convertibles or repayable grants. And it's always with a view to create a project that can then become investable for our main facility, where we can follow on with debt or equity investments of 5, 10, 15, 20 million. So we're providing finance in that early stage, trying to take something from pilot to scale, or in some cases even piloting or seeding a business, with a view that it could become investable in, say, 2 to 5 years' time. To give you a flavour of the kind of projects we invest in, so just 3 of my clients, we have an investment in a sustainable natural forest management operation in Mozambique. They have a 46,000 hectare concession. They do reduced impact logging, which is a form of selective logging mentioned earlier. And they hope to scale that to take on some neighbouring concessions and get to 200,000 hectares under management. So we're financing feasibility studies, all the preparation work, fundraising that needs to be done for them to raise finance for that kind of scale. We seeded a forest carbon accelerator based out of the Netherlands. So they work with a number of different forest projects to help them develop their carbon asset. That was a joint venture between FSC in the Netherlands and forest consultancy business. And we also provided some growth financing to a company in Colombia that is creating habitat banks because they have a biodiversity net gain compliance market in Colombia. And so that provided an opportunity for them. And I'll stop there.
Yes, thanks. Hi. So I am head of stewardship nature at PRI. PRI is the Principles for Responsible Investment. It's a global network of institutional investors that have come together around 6 principles of what responsible investment is. It's a base of over 5,000 institutional investors who have signed on to these principles, our signatories, from around the world and from throughout the investment chain, essentially. So it's a group of asset owners, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, the like, a group of asset managers, as well as service providers. PRI works to promote and enhance responsible investment through sort of a think tank function, a gathering function, but also by initiating and coordinating a range of different initiatives. My role is I work on Spring. Spring is a collaborative engagement initiative for nature. It brings together institutional investors to jointly engage with investee companies on nature-related topics. The initiative has a strategic focus on forest loss and land degradation as a key driver of nature and biodiversity loss. It engages with a total of 60 companies throughout various value chains who are seen to be influential in driving some of the land use dynamics in key priority geographies that hold tropical forest. So the initiative is publicly supported by a total of 239 of our signatories. We always like to throw the number around of the assets under management that they have. So the combined estimated number is almost $19 trillion assets managed by those who are publicly supporting Spring. Out of those, we have 94 who are actively participating in the day-to-day engagement with one or more of these 60 focus companies. We form smaller groups for each of those companies, and while we have high-level public expectations, investor expectations towards these companies, as well as a quite a detailed assessment framework that standardizes some of the indicators and expectations. We also allow for the flexibility to have very tailored engagement conversations with investee companies in order to ensure that these type of opportunities are used to really raise the most fundamental and material topics for a particular company, with the objective of contributing towards the global biodiversity framework goal of halting and reversing biodiversity loss and deforestation by 2030. Thanks.
My name is Amerigo. I'm here representing IWC, the International Woodland Company, actually one of the PRI signatories. For you to know, we are an investment manager and advisor. Currently, we have above $5 billion allocated throughout sustainable forestry, agriculture, and ecosystem restoration. We have been active since 1991, so quite some time, and now we are part of the BNP group, and together with AXA as well, now we're building a very large natural capital investment platform. For sure is our interest exactly to talk about this topic, so we're very glad to be here. In the specific, we have two main type of business lines. One is direct investments and direct management. The other one is advisory. I'm on the advisory side. So what we mostly do is actually bridging institutional investors and forestry investments. So I think that's actually something I can bring today. And we do mostly equity investments, differently from debt. So that's very brief.
Great. Thanks, everyone. It's great to have such a diverse panel in terms of finance, in terms of different types of projects, but also working with different investors as well. I think the last panel really set the stage quite well. We touched on finance, and that was highlighted as a key blocker in this space. And there was also a lot of talk around the need for data and certifications and how we make sure that finance is having an impact. We're going to get into that piece first, but I want to start by zooming out and looking at the big picture. So I guess I'll start with the question, where is the greatest potential to unlock capital for forests? And maybe I'll start with yourself, Toby. What are the most promising financial mechanisms currently out there, and what has the biggest potential in terms of getting capital into forests?
Thanks. So I guess I'll talk about what I know, and I think it's been fairly effective so far. So we provide catalytic finance, and what that means is we can take a more junior or a catalytic position in a fund structure. So it could be a first loss, or it could be a return enhancing position, so that if the fund doesn't meet its return targets or suffers a loss, then MFF, the fund that I work on, sort of takes the hit, and then that protects more senior investors so they still make their target returns. And that's been pretty effective in mobilizing private finance into the funds that we're part of. So I mean, one of our funds is hopefully going to close a $1 billion fund for restoration in Latin America this year. And it's hard to say precisely, but a lot of the senior investors have told us that the presence of this return enhancing tranche has really helped to get them on board. So that's one mechanism. It can be in the form of concessional debt or equity. The structures vary. I also think personally the development contribution facility we have for early stage financing is a real gap in the market. It's hard to get money to get track records where you can start then attracting more sizable capital. So providing this early stage finance means that we can get involved early as a DFI, we can help to de-risk the project, and we can help to guide the project to a stage where it is ready for that scale-up investment, because we're working with them over a number of years. And having that sort of, those two models plus technical assistance we can offer all together in one facility, I think has the potential to scale investment at scale, and what we need is then sort of more projects that we can finance and we can sort of work with to get to the stage where they can attract commercial capital. And what I'd love to see is more MFFs out there, so governments, other DFIs, other asset managers being able to replicate this model of kind of financing across the value chain and across across the capital continuum, as it were. If we had more MFFs out there, then I think that would be quite transformative to scaling finance for forest protection.
Thanks. Yeah, that's brilliant. And I guess in terms of private finance and mobilizing that piece beyond the concessional finance, and perhaps I'll go to Tim next. Where do we see the biggest opportunity and interest from investors in terms of forestry? Toby's talked a lot about early stage projects. Is there an interest there? But also, where can we bring in investments to scale investments beyond early stage and scale up as well?
Yeah, sure. And I'll do the same, and I'll talk about what I know. And I think it's good to just reflect a little bit on some of the trends and the developments that we've seen in this space in maybe the last 5 to 10 years. Our signatory base is extremely diverse. It includes a number of signatories that have a particular focus on the forestry sector, but most of our signatories do not. But what we have seen in this space is really this growing awareness of nature and biodiversity loss as a source of systemic risk to global economies, to portfolio values, to the ability of our signatories to create long-term value. And I think it's really in that context that we should place sort of discussions around forestry when it comes to the signatory base of the PRI, for example. Ultimately, the groups that are joining initiatives like Spring or that otherwise work on these type of topics, many of them do so because they recognize that they have a fiduciary duty to do so. If you accept that the loss of nature and biodiversity is a source of financial risk, that means you have an obligation towards your clients and your fiduciaries to act on that. And I think that's been at the root of at least a lot of momentum that we've seen in this space. PRI has its global annual conference, PRI in person. The next one is up in a few weeks. Having attended those conferences over the last few years, the amount of discussion around these topics, it's really gradually grown. And it's really one of the central focal points of the discussion at a conference like this, which it really wasn't 5 to 10 years ago. So, but obviously momentum is not the same as unlocking capital. It's not the same as actually achieving progress and results. I think it's good to recognize that investors have different roles to play. Yes, integrating these considerations into your investment decision-making process, that's the key. That's ultimately, depending on your mandate, depending on your strategy, that's going to look different for every investor. It's a very diverse sector, if you could say it's one sector at all. But integrating it in that decision, making sure that it's included as a consideration when you design your investment policies, when you implement your strategies, when you integrate that throughout the entire investment decision-making process, that's key. But in addition to that is that idea of active ownership, of being a responsible owner of the assets that you hold. And this is really sort of the space in which Spring operates and most of my work sits. It's about your active ownership policy. What do you do to ensure that those companies or those assets you invest in aren't harmful to forest, to nature, to landscapes, to your own ability to generate long-term value? And that can take many different forms, but sort of in the equity side, obviously there's the voting policies, there's the engagement with your proxy advisors, etc. But then also these engagements, and I think it shouldn't be underestimated how powerful engagements can be. And an initiative like Spring and others that are collaborative are really intended to make that as easy and as effective as possible. Joining resources, spreading out the workload, but also increasing the ability to actually have access to corporate decision makers. And then finally, disclosure, right? That's another role that obviously the financial sector also has. There's rapid developments with the frameworks. There's the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures, and others that are really starting to standardize that type of disclosure. But proving and showing what you do to identify and to manage and mitigate those risks, explain your activities, but also explain results and lessons learned from these activities. That is, it's going to drive the debate forward. And I think also not to be underestimated how the role of the financial sector within this space and towards, I think, the shared objectives that everyone in the room has, it comes in multiple ways, and there's different tools that investors have at their disposal.
I think there are 2 points that are really important to stress. Sometimes we're talking about the sector and opportunities and investor as one single unity. Actually, there are many different type of investors and many different type of investments and many different type of forests. And that's important to recognize exactly. Some investors will be willing to go into more riskier investment opportunities, some less. Some have a more impact orientation, some have a more fiduciary duty orientation. But it's extremely important to drive like conversations around the entire community to find exactly the proper matches between investments and investors. That's one of the things that is really important to unlock from our perspective.
Yeah, thanks. I think what we're hearing is the momentum is there in terms of recognizing the importance of nature, but in terms of delivery, we're right at that point where that needs to start coming in. I think it would be great to hear more about what types of investments are really a core opportunity and focus here. We've heard a lot about sustainable forestry, but is there a role for other markets that have also been raised? Carbon markets, Toby, you also mentioned potential of biodiversity credits, which are super new and still need to build that track record. How do we ensure that the investments that we are taking, that they are going to where there is the most impact? I'll go to Toby, but it would be great to get your perspective also, Karen, with the work that you're doing on the verified impact model. How can we really ensure that where we are putting that capital, that it's really effective?
Sure, yeah. I think FSC is a great place to start if we're doing forestry investments. I think, also not paid by FSC. It has the internal benefit if it really helps with our due diligence process. It aligns very well with our ESG standards, which is the IFC performance standards you may be familiar with. So it can fast track that in a sense, doesn't replace it sadly. But it also really helps externally because we get a lot of pressure around why you're investing in forestry. Plantations are all bad. Natural forest management is extractive. So it helps having that external third party, universally, you'd say, you sort of recognize standards that we invest in FSC certified companies or companies that are working towards it, or PEFC. So I think that gives you that assurance of impact in the forestry space. When you're talking about plantation or sustainable natural forest management, I think it's I guess more nascent and developing in the what can be called natural climate or nature-based solutions market. I think there is general sort of coalescence and acceptance on standards of high quality for carbon projects, for nature projects. So I think that's developing, and I think as DFIs generally, we tend to move as a bit of a herd, and we're all sort of gradually moving like a slow herd into the sort of natural capital space now that it is becoming more recognised that the impact there is genuine and can be verified and has third-party acceptance, and we can defend that decision to questions in Parliament or questions from NGOs that come as to why we're doing the investments that we're doing.
So with FSC, obviously you've got the underlying forest management certification, which all forests have to have, but then that additionality of the verified impact, producing those ecosystem services. So basically, as Toby said, it's all audited, fully verifiable. The forests have to produce that data to prove, A, that they're going from an initial baseline to improving the forest, depending on what ecosystem service they're doing. You've got a variety of ecosystem services you can do. Obviously, carbon has been one of the major ones, but biodiversity is becoming more common, and water particularly is becoming more common as we have droughts, we have floods. So basically what we do is, as part of the verified impact, we also can supply a contract to the forest. So if, for example, there's an indigenous population within that forest, we can ensure that that funding is spread, not just with the forest management, but also with the communities that are involved in that forest, in protecting that forest. So that money is spread across whoever is involved in the forest, so it's equitable. And in order to do that, you need transparency, you need a certification. You can't rely on standards in countries, for example, across Africa or Latin America. You can't rely on them to be completely independent. There's always going to be some corruption, so you need those independent certifications in order to bring that finance in. And I think if you've got that additionality, it's going to really, really help bring that in. For example, forest commodity assets have been seen to be delivering for the financial sector year on year. So it is something that they are getting much more involved in, and companies are definitely becoming much more aware that they need to de-risk, whether it's their investments or their whole production line, because if they don't de-risk, they will not have a company in a few years' time.
Yeah, and I think it would be good to get the perspective also from the wider investor community in terms of this piece around tracking and data. So perhaps Mara go first, but then also Tim, in terms of how we're able to do that tracking. We've fairly avoided the EUDR conversation so far, but I think that's a good example of a regulation that requires a level of data collection, and that is throwing up barriers. How is the investor community focusing on this? What are the key barriers, but then also what are the opportunities in terms of making sure that the investments are accountable and transparent?
Very interesting. I will say that actually the EUDR is not a big concern of investors. So it kind of goes on the other way compared to a lot of what I've heard today. And it links very well to the fact that actually forest managers are very close to the forest and actually have a lot of data. And that's something we've been working on for several years now, actually is unfolding the potential of data that are there. Sometimes it's really just about establishing systems and being capable of monitoring. Many forest practices are great and produce results that can be accounted for and tracked. What is missing, and it came also in the previous panel a little bit, maybe is the actual tools and how do we use like large forest inventories, how do we translate into a measurable impact. That's for sure something that is missing at the moment. But that's kind of one of the things that a lot of investors like, is when they start to understand that compared to other type of investments, data are there and makes them very safe compared to other asset classes.
Yeah, I'd like to. So my mind goes a bit broader, but it also goes to. So I'm Dutch, and I'm immediately reminded of one of our football greats, Johan Cruyff, who had once said that he had never seen a bag of money score a goal. And I think that's actually a good inspiration to say, look, we've also never seen a bag of money save a tree, you know? And I think that it really comes down to, I think, a point that you made, David. You know, this is not to say that, hey, we shouldn't invest in sustainable forestry or in protecting these type of landscapes. But it means exactly that the finance sector doesn't operate in isolation. It doesn't operate in a vacuum. It really requires not just data, it requires data in order to make these right investment decisions. But it also requires an investment context, a regulatory context, a policy context. Ultimately, you know, it's, in my mind, finance it's the tool to create incentives, right, for a certain type of behavior. And that incentive can be harmful, as you've pointed out, with the harmful subsidies, and it can be more positive, right? ultimately, there's a fundamental role for governments here. And I think that's where, it again comes back to this fiduciary duty. In order for PRI signatories to ensure these long-term results, they require to have a regulatory and a policy environment that is supportive towards that goal, i.e. is supportive towards halting and reversing biodiversity loss. So one of the things in which Spring has been working on this as a corporate engagement initiative is to also recognize that there's many different actors who are influencing policies, right? Including companies, including the investee companies of our signatories. So there's also this element of lobby, essentially, of political engagement by corporate, and that is a two-edged sword. That can be constructive, it can be a great opportunity to provide solutions and ideas, but it can also be used to maintain short-term vested interests that go against these type of long-term objectives. So I think it's one of the ways in which, one of the considerations when we designed Spring is also in a way to kind of circumvent a broader discussion about nature and biodiversity data, which is extremely complex, by saying, hey, there's a lot of action that can be done in the absence of that type of sort of comprehensive, all-encompassing, correct and actionable biodiversity data by looking at that policy context.
And I guess COP30 is round the corner. We've heard from the previous panel that that we really need that political will to take this forward. So I guess my question to all the panelists would be, in terms of what COP30 looks like, in terms of what countries are putting in their NDCs for forests, what practically is needed in order to unlock and scale finance in this space? If you had to choose one thing, which is so difficult, that would really be the outcome of COP30, whether that be policy or whether that be a model such as the TFFF, what should be the focus going forwards?
I can start. I'm going to have two things so far. I mean, the first one, I think, in the space that we operate in, was mentioned in the earlier panel, was this sort of joining of compliance and voluntary carbon markets. The carbon market, not perfect, but the most mature market I think we have for a lot of forest restoration and conservation activity. So if you could bring compliance market demands to the voluntary sector, I think that could be transformative in terms of finance. And if you could get, very standard offtake agreements and well-recognized offtake agreements in place for that compliance or voluntary markets, that could really unlock a lot of finance. So that would be great to see. And the other one on the policy side, I would say that's probably 10, 100 times bigger, is to mention, I mean, a lot of global portfolios have a lot of deforestation linked investments in value chains within their portfolio. So actually just getting institutional investors who manage sort of the world's capital to actually actively look at their portfolios and say, where is there deforestation in my portfolio? How can I work with my clients to address that deforestation in their portfolio? And how can I actively start intentionally trying to move my portfolio to forest positive investments? It doesn't have to be forestry, it doesn't have to be ag commodities, but looking at how there can be a forest positive value chain. That would be the most transformative in terms of allocating capital to forest positive investments, yeah.
So from a certification point of view, what we need to do is lift country standards up to those certification levels. Yes, it might put us out of business, but we were never here solely just to be in business. We were here to improve forestry across the world, and we do need to improve policy across the world globally. not just in Western countries who are already doing the right things. We need to improve it globally in the nations where they're losing the most forests. And in order to do that, I think we also did two things. I think it's really important that we look beyond, if we're talking to investors, we're getting more and more banks coming to us and asking us, what can we do to de-risk investments? How can we educate our investors? Because if they're continuing to invest in deforestation, we will not have investment in the future. So how can we educate them to prove that short-term investment is not going to help them? And I think there needs to be policy around investment as well, globally. So it needs to be a similar thing to, looking at oceans globally and committing. We need to do that with forests.
Yeah, maybe just to build on that, thanks for going first. I think it's exactly that point. It's sort of what would be great to see come out of COP is, some signals of long-term thinking, ultimately. And I think that's where, there's too many areas in which we're not seeing that. And I think that goes when it comes to some of the policies and the regulations. And, I think EUDR is a taboo word today, but it's really one of those indications where we're seeing so many back and forths that's not a long-term vision that's being implemented. We're not seeing that with a lot of companies that are rolling back some of their sustainability commitments. We're not seeing that in all areas of the finance sector either. And we're also not seeing that sometimes in these big events like COP, which is always a fantastic platform to launch something new, right? But it'd be great to see indications of actual implementations of past commitments. Talking about the deforestation-free portfolios, I think there's many others where, it's ultimately if we can see signals of, hey, we're following through on the things that we have committed to and set in the past, like that'd be really welcome.
Yeah, it's really hard to add after all of this, but for sure the long-term perspective, and I'll bring a very tangible example. A forest takes decades to grow, and if you have an incentive that says that you need to have a return in a year or 5 years, that's some incompatibility over there. So that's extremely important to align the long-term perspective of investment horizons. For sure, what will be great is actually that people and governments that come home from the COP then implement something actively and fast. I think what finance is really good at is creating new markets. So the moment you have an opportunity and there is a regulatory environment that helps, there will be some kind of financial incentive. I give an example on ecosystem restoration, which seems like a non-investable universe. A few months back, we closed together with other investors 400 million restoration fund in the US. That's huge. And the reason why is because the US, no one will think about that, but actually has a great regulatory framework for mitigation and restoration activities. So it's these type of things that countries should start implementing after COPs.
Okay, great. Should send all these recommendations to the conference. So we've got about 15 minutes left. I think it would be good to open to questions from the audience, so we've got lots of time for that. So I think.
Thank you. Return on capital invested. Are you having to have a discussion with your investors about reducing their ROI expectations in comparison with, let's call them, traditional investments?
So if we take traditional investments in the sense of conventional forestry, I think it actually goes back to what was discussed in the previous panel, where now actually the baseline is very high for a lot of forest managers. So I would say the investors go into this field knowing what they're going to pay and what is going to be the investment return, and there is no discount on sustainable forestry. They're actually pretty attractive forestry, pretty attractive return. Of course, there could be some trade-off when you go more for impact, and that of course has a cost, but the cost depends also. It can be taken because some investors come with a strategic allocation with a specific impact focus, so they require lower return. Other investors will disregard these type of opportunities because it's too low and they're looking at actually just for return. Maybe here I'll just make a point, otherwise I will forget. One of the things that the financial sector is really missing now is a real bucket for forestry and sustainable forestry and natural capital. When an investor comes and wants to make investments in forestry and sustainable forestry, and then goes back and looks at the strategic allocation that comes from the CIO, there is no money for that. They have really interested into pursuing certain strategies, but then it's really hard to fit. Is it an infrastructure investment? Is it a real estate investment? So that's actually something that the sector themselves can fix and should fix very fast, actually.
Yeah, maybe I can speak from the FMO perspective. So we're trying to build a portfolio of up to €1 billion in forestry, so bigger than just the fund that I work on. And both within our fund and then within the wider portfolio, what we're trying to do is build a diversified portfolio. So we want to have some debt investments, some private debt funds, as well as direct corporate debt. We want to have some equity investments, and we want to have some early stage sort of higher risk investments. So we're trying to build a balanced portfolio that still delivers on target returns for our shareholders and other stakeholders. And we'll do that, I think, by balancing the portfolio in that sense. I'd say one of the challenges is a lot of forestry is suited to equity because particularly, greenfield forestry, it needs time. You don't want to leverage it with too much debt too early. So that means that we find there's a lot more equity opportunities than we find debt opportunities generally. The debt opportunities are more in the greening finance than the financing green. So that's one constraint we have, because even if we can, say, accept a lower return, we have regulatory requirements that limit the amount, say, of equity that we can have because of capital ratios and things like that. So there's these policy things in the background that I think people outside of finance don't necessarily realize translates into, why are you not doing more of this, XYZ high impact stuff?
Great, thanks. We've got 2 questions, 2 hands up in the mid to front rows. Lady in the green vest, and then also a lady in the grey jacket.
Thank you. Son? Yeah. Rosie Teasdale, I am paid by FSC. There's a lot of talk in the previous panel about the need for more impact data. And if you were to advise FSC, what impact data do you think would most unlock capital, or is it dependent upon the investor?
Maybe, should we get the second question and then we can loop that?
Hi, Sophie Kamphuis, MN. Maybe also a question for Toby on the blended finance funds that you mentioned. What is your approach to attract institutional investors, as this might often not be a structure that they're familiar with, though they might be interested in the topic itself? So curious if you see growing interest, and how do you explain the concept to them?
Great. So one question on impact data and another on how we attract a larger range of investors. If we go Toby, and then great, Tim, also to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, okay, then I don't get to answer the harder question. Blended finance, I think, interestingly, I was at an event the other day that talked about sort of blended finance as an asset class, so not necessarily looking at what the blended finance underlying assets are, but this idea of a blended finance fund where you have this risk return augmentation happening because of the public capital, and how interesting is blended finance funds as an asset class to institutional investors. I think that sort of resonates with something that increasingly institutional investors can understand, and getting to a scale within funds where they can invest, because ticket size is often a problem, and we're investing in LDCs, emerging markets. The actual underlying ticket sizes are probably too small often, as well as the problem of currency risk, etc. So I think that's one way that we could potentially get more investment into blended finance vehicles more broadly. If you layer on forestry and natural capital to that, it does become more tricky. And I guess the other way, I would go back to what I say in terms of how we can leverage institutional capital for forest protection. I think it's probably more in the deforestation-free commodities type models out there, because that's closer to maybe what they're already doing. You can start financing corporates in those value chains that are already at the scale that they're used to financing, and those corporates can have real significant impact. If you talk about global traders, the ABCDs, if you talk about the likes of Nestle and Mondelez and Olam, the impact that they can potentially have on their supply chain is significant, and if finance sort of can help to facilitate actions within those supply chain, I think that's where you can get more finance in and more impact.
Thanks. Yeah, on the data question, and thanks again. You gave me a few minutes to think about that. But the thing I think that comes to mind is really around the biodiversity data. What we've seen happen a lot in the finance sector is this need to try to capture biodiversity footprints or biodiversity impacts and dependencies of investment portfolios. And a lot of times this has been trying to put a square peg into a round hole, right? It's really difficult to do that. Some of the signals that we've been picking up is, there's been a lot of work around a modeled biodiversity data. Valuable and very useful, but also with limitations. And I think it's the type of actual empirical data, like Yuri, like you just presented, that ultimately doesn't depend on are the underlying assumptions of models correct and applicable, but we have the granular on the ground empirical data, whether through wildlife traps or there's the environmental DNA methods and all these there's a lot of development seems to be going on in this space. I think that would greatly benefit because ultimately it would enhance the accuracy of that type of calculations that a lot of the financial institutions need to make in order to try to capture these important topics into their existing Excel sheet-based decision-making processes.
Great, thank you.
Can I add just very specifically on this one, metrics that are easy to integrate with other asset classes. That's what you should look into. Because in the end, forestry investments are going to go into a huge investment portfolio. So anything that can be compared is great.
We've probably got time for one or two, or maybe even three questions, which we have three, so that's great. Yeah.
Where do you see the role of the state and state subsidy in unlocking capital and in encouraging sustainable forest management?
Great. So one on where the role of the state. We'll get another one at the back.
Yeah, really agree with the comments of Tim and Toby with regard to the imperative to take mainstream finance sector action to achieve deforestation conversion-free portfolios. I've had the great privilege of working with the Finance Sector Deforestation Action Initiative with some of the financial institutions involved in the room today, really leading on this and looking both to take this mainstream so that it is not a leadership action to work with investees and policymakers and so on toward DCF finance, but that it's just across the board what financial institutions do. At the same time, these financial institutions are understandably very deeply concerned about the persistent market failure of valuing intact forests, and would be great to hear a little bit further from the panel about that latter bit in terms of what else can be done, needs to be done, including big, bold initiatives like the Tropical Forest Forever facility that is being teed up for launch at COP30. Thanks.
Great. We'll start with those two. So I don't think either of them was specific, so open floor. Tim.
I'll go first this time. Yeah. No, I mean, I think we touched on a number of the elements around the role of the state already. Subsidies, I think ultimately that is a key thing. If there's a multitude more harmful subsidies than there are forest positive subsidies, that's a role of the state to really turn that around and to ultimately make it less risky and more financially interesting also for the private sector to invest in the forest positive opportunities as opposed to those harmful activities. In addition to regulations, right? Value chain regulations, the due diligence regulations, but also landscape protection regulations. There's a role of the state that's very, very apparent, obviously. So I think it's in those two elements, ultimately setting the parameters for how markets and how financial sector, how they operate.
Yeah, maybe I just add to that. I think I was at a conference where someone said, nothing has mobilized private finance for supply chain traceability like EUDR and preparing for EUDR. And then there's the plea is always, I think, for predictability and consistency. So actually complaining about EUDR, but then complain even more when it keeps being delayed because you've now invested so much in getting your supply chain ready for EUDR. And well, okay, is it ever going to come? What form is it going to come in? Have I invested in this and I didn't need to? So I guess the role of the state is bold moves like EUDR are great, and then stick to them and don't keep chopping and changing them. I think you often hear that about the UK's biodiversity net gain regulation as well. It keeps being tinkered with, and that makes it really hard to make investment decisions that are really long-term investment decisions. So consistency would be the plea, I guess.
And just on that, yes, the state has a huge role to play. Basically, they provide agricultural subsidies, which might cause deforestation, but also the fact that all of the new trade agreements, particularly in the UK, are we outsourcing our impacts to other countries? We might be getting our farmers to do everything right, but if we're buying cheap products from elsewhere, what is the impact on that? So if we're going to do that, if we're going to put trade agreements in place, we have to abide by our own rules and ensure that those trade agreements have the same legislation applied to them, that there's no deforestation, that there's no harm to indigenous populations, that there's no harm to the environment in the countries where we're going to get our food, as applies to the UK, because otherwise it's not fair on UK farmers, and it's also not fair on the countries where we're outsourcing our impact.
Yeah, definitely. And to link to that second question, we've got these big mechanisms coming forward, such as the Tropical Finance Forever facility, that has been brought forward by the Brazilian government in collaboration with a lot of other governments. Is there a role for these kind of big mechanisms, and what does that look like in terms of scaling finance for forests?
I can try. I think it's really hard. The major problem, honestly, is that a lot of investors are disregarding these type of initiatives, but it is not because they want to do it. But I think there is a lack of understanding of nature, lack of understanding of what needs to be done in such a specific forest, right? An investor comes with climate change in mind, biodiversity, but then doesn't really have the capacity. An investment team is limited in resources then to address deforestation in the tropics, let's say. That's very specific. For a lot of people, that falls outside the mandate. I think that's a major problem. Like these big initiatives kind of trigger the minds of a lot of the people on top, and that's great, but they have a hard time trickling down into organizations. Where there is plenty of potential then is actually into educating more. And that's happening. I mean, sustainability, ESG teams are growing and people are getting more specialized. I think that's where this type of events and initiatives will get more powerful over time.
Just to try and answer the lady at the back's question as well about how we can internalize the sort of externality of forest protection in supply chains. I think it's a really tough one. I think there's a number of sort of pre-competitive platforms within a certain value chain, say palm oil, where actually the major actors can come together and agree a mechanism whereby they will either finance or provide subsidized finance or provide some sort of incentive for forest conservation action in their sort of sourcing landscape. So not the sort of premium model where, you know, like a fair trade premium, it's more sort of general landscape financing within the sourcing landscape, because they recognize that even they might not know exactly which palm oil supplier they're getting their palm oil from. They know it's generally this landscape, and they need that landscape to be resilient.
I think we've got time for one more comment.
Yeah, one more thought. Also in response to the question from the back. First of all, just to say that it's really the right time now to indeed try to get more or mainstreaming some of the great work that leading institutional investors have done on the topic of deforestation. But having a leader group is extremely important as well. So just a shout out to the great work of the people that have been working on FSDA, for example. I think the other answer to your question may lie in evidence of the financial materiality of the risk of forest loss. And I think that's a question that's really difficult to answer, because you can answer it in many different ways on many different levels. There is a general understanding that yes, deforestation is a source of financial risk. But I think to really try to quantify that on different levels, we do need more convincing evidence to compel some of those mainstream investors to take further action. There's been some amazing work done in Brazil where they try to project some of the financial cost on the agricultural sector of deforestation and the subsequent change in weather patterns and rainfall patterns. I think we need a lot more on that, both on a company by company level, on a portfolio level, on a macroeconomic level.
Great. I think that's a great call to action to finish. So thanks to all the panelists. Great to get a round of applause.
Well, hello everyone. What an interesting afternoon we've had. I've got both the blessing and the curse of trying to summarise all of the wonderful discussion that we've had today. I also stand in the way of you and refreshments, which I know is always a very dangerous position to put myself in. So I'm Georgina, I'm Head of Policy and Campaigns at the Zoological Society of London, and I wanted to structure my closing remarks around a few questions to you. So one of those is, why act? Do we still need to ask this question, given the evidence and the cases that we've heard today? After today, do we feel like we have the solutions? Have we heard enough about what the solutions are on the table? And then how do we scale and accelerate change? Because I think that's a common theme and challenge that we've been coming up against as well. So to start with the why act part of my reflections. So my background's in international policy. I've been working on international negotiations since about 2015. So all of the sort of murky world of the climate negotiations, the biodiversity negotiations is where I tend to exist. And if I think back to 2015 and I think back to my first COP, and I look now at the nature negotiations that we had in Colombia last year, and the scale and pace of change, I think sometimes we need to pause and give ourselves a little bit of credit for how much progress we have actually made, both in terms of awareness of biodiversity loss. We've heard about it today as a systemic risk, and the awareness around the importance of nature and the importance of biodiversity. I think I saw more corporates engaged in the biodiversity negotiations last year than ever before. And also the rhetoric around connecting nature and climate and how these are both challenges and shared solutions that can't exist or be solved without each other. So I think forests are the perfect illustration of this sort of synergies piece as well. They're vital for regulating the global climate, supporting biodiversity and sustaining livelihoods. And I think we have the evidence base to know why they're important. I hope we don't have to keep asking ourselves that question. Just to highlight a few examples, global forests are estimated to be worth almost twice the value of global stock markets. We now understand better than ever before how forests regulate rainfall patterns across continents, influence our weather systems, agriculture, and water processes. And yet, despite this immense value, forests receive less than 4% of international climate finance. Global Canopy's Forest 500 data shows that 60% of the world's financial institutions with the highest deforestation risk still lack a deforestation policy. And this imbalance highlights how much more needs to be done to align both the economic and the ecological value of forests and mobilise finance and solutions at scale to protect and manage them sustainably. So how are we feeling? Do we feel like we have those solutions? People, give me an indication. A little nod, a boo. We can do a kind of like a thumb. Yeah, everyone's feeling a little bit shaky on it. Well, if I start with the policy landscape, because that's what I know, and I've been asked to connect this into the COP30 process and the upcoming negotiations that we have in November. So we know that COP30 will be a historic moment. It's the first climate conference in the Amazon, and the spotlight is once again turned to whether it can deliver actions for forests. I'm also often asked whether the outcomes of a COP actually matter. I'll sort of leave that a little bit to you to think about as well. But in my opinion, they genuinely do have a impact on the real economy. They signal a direction of travel, they give confidence, they set long-term goals. They're thinking all the way through to 2050 and beyond. We've got those long-term projections. And they create the space, the headroom, and the narrative for action. So I hope sitting in your organisations, you feel like they do provide you with that case. They're inherently flawed in many ways as well. I'm not blind to that, but I hope they have their benefits as well. And there was a point made earlier on political will as well, and making sure that we have that leadership. And I think reflecting on the journey that forest commitments have made, again, if we look back to COP26, which was in the UK, we've really moved from high-level forest declarations to now talking about a very tangible and investable solution in Brazil. So I think we have made some significant progress from that space. So just to pause a little bit and talk about Tropical Forest Forever facility, we've heard a little bit about this today. I just want to underline why it's particularly important. It's a Forest Nation-led initiative, so when we're talking about leadership, Brazil are demonstrating that leadership. And I think that question of leadership has inherently changed as well. It's now coming from the countries that are saying, these are the solutions we need, this is what works for us, and it's now our role to listen to that and facilitate that and to support that as much as possible. The TFFF hopefully will provide long-term, reliable, results-based payments for protecting standing forest. Again, this is a conversation I don't think we could have had 10 years ago. How do we actually value the forests that are still standing? And it's not just rewarding recovery after loss. It's also very innovative in the sense that it's embedding IPLCs in the heart of the mechanism, with a commitment to channel at least 20% of payments directly to Indigenous peoples and local communities. We've had a few references here today, but I think the importance of recognising who lives in the forests we are talking about and who are the custodians of the forest that we are talking about today is incredibly important. And there is a role for the private sector here. It's a government-led initiative, but it's a public-private initiative as well. So there's a role for all of you here to support that, to say why it's important, to say why it's needed in the conversations that you're having with government and other actors, and to really sort of create this sense of ambition and excitement around this initiative, because it is really groundbreaking. It really could change the game. We've also heard a lot about a range of private sector solutions today. So the importance of transparency and disclosure, the role and limits of certification, how regulation and government-led initiatives can help or hinder progress. So how do we scale and accelerate change? I've heard a few challenges and solutions mentioned today. Data, I think, has been a big theme, if everybody would agree with me on that. I think that came up repeatedly. Biodiversity is inherently complex. I always say it's in the name, it's biodiversity. You can't have one thing that measures it. It's diverse, and it's locally and scalably specific. There's also something about managing complexity across supply chains. I really liked the point that was made in the first panel about closing those gaps and that kind of full circle from producer to consumer, but also back again, and that knowledge sharing and understanding. I think we live in a very sort of data-rich world, but again, I'm hearing that creates a lot of demands on people to keep up with that, opportunities and challenges. And I think that kind of certainty and long-term thinkings and solutions really came through in the final panel as well, especially from government. And that need for continuity and to celebrate progress on a journey, I think, really came through. So that's what I tried to do at the beginning there, where I reflected on how far we've come in the last 10 years. We have made a lot of progress. Let's celebrate that. And I really heard that point on following through on commitments. And I think there's a question for the private sector sort of amongst us as well. What is your role in supporting government-led initiatives? When we're thinking about EUDR, that kind of balance between making sure it works for you, but also making sure it's rigorous, it's robust, but also supporting it. So not going in and slowing it down. I don't know if anybody's done that, but yeah, okay, we'll leave that with you. So I think a few key messages to take away from me before I close. I couldn't find 3 or 5. I wanted like 3 or 5. I've got 4, which I always feels a bit, yeah, anyway, 3 or 5 sounds better. So the first one was that investment in innovative and scalable projects and solutions. So I think not being afraid to try things that might fail in places that are risky, and really try investing in some of those projects, those pilot projects, those things that could lead to something really big. There's lots of really good examples of what works in practice, so let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's try new things, but also let's support what we know already works. There's that point on supporting government-led initiatives such as the TFFF and making sure that when we're talking about more and better regulation, that we're also practicing what we preach, so that when we're talking to government, we're being supportive about that too. The third point was around co-developing solutions with the countries and the people who are custodians of the forest. So when we are talking about solutions, we're talking about opportunities. Let's make sure that's a shared conversation, not just one that we're having in the room here today. And finally, we don't operate in isolation. I think that point was made across several of the panels as well. And I think truly cross-sector partnerships deliver some of the best benefits and solutions. I've seen that across my career as well. So genuine partnerships across government, across private sector, across civil society, who all bring something slightly different to the table and all who bring slightly different strengths to the table as well. I think some of the best examples we have of innovative solutions come from those conversations, whether it's my previous organisation was the RSPB, and we did some work with water companies, for example. I know ZSL has been trialling some of these innovative partnerships around timber transparency. So there are all of these amazing examples of best practice. So I think this is a cross-sector room. So let's, as we move over to drinks, have some of these exciting and innovative conversations. So thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to pass over to Ollie to close us out again. But thank you so much. It's been a really stimulating afternoon.
Thank you.